Hi everybody, welcome to our meetup. It's the Agile Leadership and Business Agility meetup. We run these every month, and today we've got a special guest speaker, Dave Snowden. Say hello, Dave, so we'll see you and hear you.
Hi.
Brilliant stuff. We're going to be talking a bit about leadership and management today. We'll have a section at the end for some questions, as always the way to go for. So if you could put any questions directly into the group chat, I'll collate them throughout the talk, and we'll have 10-15 minutes at the end for a bit of Q&A, if that's okay for everybody. Well, without further ado, I'll mute myself and I'll let Dave take the reins. Thank you, Dave.
Okay, so I'll keep an eye on the chat as we go through this. So I may pick up some material as we go. What I want to do, and I'm not going to use slides, I may sort of pick up on a few things later on. I want to talk about some of the new work we're doing on organizational design at the moment. It's suddenly become a sort of major theme coming out of complexity. Part of that is obviously triggered by COVID, in that people are working at home but working in different ways. And certainly from a cognitive age point of view, COVID has been quite good for us. I mean, I am feeling deeply stressed because I haven't been to Heathrow Airport in 6 months. And the car sort of tries to drive me there on an occasional basis. But one of the things that COVID did was for people to recognize that uncertainty is actually inherent in the way that we work and think. And a few of us for many years have refused to compromise with people over the nature of complexity and the way it changes an organization, and refused to go along with some of the sort of very algorithmic approaches like holacracy and the whole Crocs type material. So we've argued for a different take on leadership, on organizational design, and particularly on how you manage in a crisis. And as a result of that, kind of like people have remembered that when the real crisis hit, and that sort of generated work and business, mainly government at the moment, certainly within the NHS and the like. So I want to make a few sort of statements up front, which I don't think are controversial, but other people do. The first one is, if anybody ever these days on any social media puts up a 2-column table with bad things on the left and good things on the right, I tend to attack it. I've been doing on one LinkedIn one today, which basically had we go from leadership to networks. Well, and it went on down from profit to purpose and so on. Those sort of things worry me a lot because they're a sort of context-free pendulum swing. In a real crisis, if I look at the work we do, for example, in military decision-making, there are times when you want a hierarchy and times when you want to deploy within a network capability. It's not a either or. It's actually a both and. If you don't have a hierarchy in an organization, the alpha males will create one anyway. And if they don't, the alpha females do. And neither of them are particularly desirable because they're not managed or controlled or handle diversity. So there are certain features which are just a part of the way that human beings organize and manage, and hierarchy is one of them. The other one, which is critical, is informal networks. And if I go back to the origins of Cynefin, and Cynefin is actually 21 years old this year in October. We're going to be organizing some stuff around that. I hadn't realized. It's first published in its current form in 1999, the 5-domain framework, in a book on knowledge management. But the first major Cynefin article was Complex Acts of Knowing, and that was based on work I was then doing in IBM. In the field of knowledge management. And specifically, I was one of the people who challenged the idea that you could make tacit knowledge explicit, the whole Nanaka-Seki model. In fact, for people in Agile, I've come up against the Nanaka twice, one with Seki and then the next time with Scrum, and kind of like opposed him on both occasions. So I was one of the ones who are arguing that tacit knowledge can't be made explicit. A whole body of tacit knowledge is held in narrative form, and a whole body of it is held in social connections. And particularly that the true transfer of tacit knowledge requires a very high degree of trust. And trust doesn't exist because some corporate executive or consultant thinks that trust will be a good idea or will be a good purpose. Trust is built over years or built in actually in short time frame in intenser activity. And it can be lost in seconds, yeah, if you're hypocritical in some way. So I did some basic work on the way informal networks grew in IBM, and it was fairly easy because we had a bastardized version of Lotus Notes called Team Room, which everybody in Lotus hated, but everybody in IBM loved because it didn't have all the features, but you could set it up easily. And if it didn't work quite, if it occasionally fell over, it didn't matter because you were working with people you trusted. And what I actually found is the ratio between informal and formal communities within IBM was 64:1. And that was just those who were using technology for some type of collaboration. And remember, this is 21 years ago. This is before social media took off. Yeah. So this is early days of collaborative software. It's been picked up and used extensively. It was a Lotus Notes variation. And we still had the old sort of mainframe collaboration as well at that time, which was used for email. And I still remember going to the chief knowledge officer for IBM, who knew nothing whatsoever about the subject. I mean, IBM had myself and Larry Prusak, who were reasonably well known internationally on the field, but we were largely ignored by the internal function. And I thought that she would listen to me on that because my argument was going to be we should be more formally managing the informal networks. But that means managing connections between people, not managing the people or managing their information or knowledge flow. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I now know from the later work on complexity theory that what matters is in organizations is how things link, not what they are. Yeah, so how things, and this also, we'll come back to that in terms of management. So I went to her and basically said, look, we found this out. I think therefore we should put more emphasis on the informal, not the formal. And she looked at me and she says, so how do we bring all those informal networks and make them part of the formal communities of practice? And it was like, you just don't get this, do you? Yeah. The IBM communities of practice, as in all cases, were deeply political. And I do find it ironic that Agile has suddenly picked up on communities of practice and communities of interest. And it's repeating all the same mistakes that knowledge management made 21 years ago. It is really rather amusing, right? I mean, I'll happily pick that one up later. The basic fact is if you're in a formal community, you have 2 or 3 problems. One is the level of abstraction at which the community operates. So let me go through this because it's a fundamental part of early Cynefin. If I work at a very high level of abstraction, that's where I have conversations with myself, yeah, which is normally, but not always, the most intelligent audience I have. I sometimes worry about it because it isn't, because I share all my own, the same education, knowledge, experience, etc., and all of that is available to me. The lowest level of abstraction is where I write an instruction down, not knowing what the audience is, yeah, or even draw it to get rid of the concept of language. So the level of abstraction is key to information flow. So if I talk, as I'm going to later, for example, about aporia, I'm going to assume that hardly anybody in the audience knows about aporetic structures and the creation of aporia. That's new language, yeah. But if I was to, or if I want to talk about affordances or the link between assemblages and strange attractors. Now, these are all things which are highly relevant to what I'm talking about, but I'm using an academic language and I'm using it in a very particular way. Therefore, the number of people I can have an intelligent conversation with is very small, but it's very economical in terms of the energy cost of conversation. On the other hand, if I want to explain aporia to this group, I have to drop down a level of abstraction, which I'll do later on. And therefore, it will take me more time because I can't use one word to explain a whole set of concepts. So that's the concept of abstraction. And against that, I used to actually look at the cost of codification. What does it cost you to structure this material? So basically, at a very high level of abstraction, the cost of codification is 0. At a very low level of abstraction, the cost of codification becomes infinite. And there's kind of like a sweet spot in between them. So the problem with a formal community is you have multiple levels of abstraction. So for example, Larry Prusak wrote a book called Working Knowledge, which is a classic. I remember I phoned him up and said, we're going to have to play in this community of practice, Larry, otherwise we're not going to be seen to play in team. And he said, you can, I can't be bothered. And 3 weeks later, I phoned him up and said, you were right, and I was withdrawing. Because it was a community of practice for everybody interested in the field of knowledge management within IBM. And therefore, the range of abstraction was just too high. So I was happy to go there to teach, but I wasn't going to learn anything from it. Because people were going through a journey I'd been through 5 or 6 years before. It would have actually been a lot better if Larry and I had been in a community practice with the other principles of other disciplines in IBM, because we'd have learnt from the transdisciplinary approach. So one problem was the attempt to lump by subject and not take levels of abstraction into account. And that's actually quite important in Agile and elsewhere going downstream. And it's still important for online collaboration. But then the most fundamental aspect that we started to work on was informal networks and informal communities. Because the fact is, in an informal network, the level of abstraction costs you nothing as an organization, and trust flows without an issue. So if you choose voluntarily to work with people in an informal grouping, that trust and cost of codification are irrelevant as a company cost. The energy is actually there. And there's all sorts of coded language that you use. I still remember sitting in IBM at Bedfont Lakes, and somebody came up and I was with my team and I said, oh guys, this is Tony, he's one of the good guys, and 2 or 3 other verbal clues. It's called trust tagging. I've tagged him into the group. I've said, this guy is okay, we can talk with him. About half an hour later, another guy came up and I said, oh guys, you don't know Peter. Peter's from management consultancy. Really great guy. And that was code to don't tell the bastard anything. Because he can't be trusted. And that is really common in informal networks. They have ways to include and exclude that you can't actually manage. But informal networks entangle an organization, and entanglement is a key concept in complexity theory. It's where the bramble bushes in the thicket metaphor comes from. And the issue in managing for complexity is, do you allow the entanglement to grow naturally, or do you stimulate its formation? So let's go on to bramble bushes a bit, and I'll come back to informal networks. So the metaphor of describing a complex adaptive system as like bramble bushes in a thicket comes from Alicia Geraro in an article, and Kurtz and I stole it with permission for a paper. So if you think about it, bramble bushes have lots of thorns but produce lovely blackberries, and they often grow in thickets or small woodlands, so everything is entangled with everything else. And as I was saying earlier on, in lockdown, there's one valley in England which is in the Brecon Beacons. So myself and 2 doctor friends have explored that one valley with 7 completely different routes when we weren't allowed into Wales. So it's kind of like walk up to the Welsh border, look at the promised land, walk back down again. And Paul, who leads the group, is interested in old buildings. So he started to find interesting routes along the floor of the valley. And we discovered the reality of bramble bushes in a thicket. I still have the scars all over my legs from trying to break through this sort of material. It's impossible. Everything is entangled with everything else. If you pull one thread, you may break things. In fact, the only way to get through it is a machete, which we now carry when Paul is designating the route on broad principles. But on the other hand, if I can deliberately create the entanglement, then I can manage the system. And this is the first thing I want to go through, is 3 separate techniques for entanglement. And remember, what you're trying to do here is you're trying to connect people with other people. You're not trying to manage the results of the connectivity. So there's a broad principle here, is if everybody is within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else within an organization, all sorts of things happen without formal management. Because it's the trust tagging principle again. So if I can phone somebody up I mean, you've all done this at some stage. You know, somebody phones you up and asks you a question, and you say, I don't know, but you know, Fred knows about this. Why didn't you phone up Fred and tell him I said it was okay to chat? That's called a trust tag. Yeah, and Fred will trust you at that point. Now, that type of tagging doesn't go beyond 2 or 3 degrees of separation before it breaks down. So we started to work on methods or tools to institute that, and 3 of them are worth talking about. One is the concept of trios. Now, we use that far more extensively now. We use it for unarticulated need mapping. It's also a pre-Scrum technique for user requirement definition within Agile. And it's also a society change initiative. And it's based on the fact that human beings like to work in threes. It's actually quite interesting. If you go out to dinner with strangers, yeah, and there's 2 of you, there's a lot of tension because the whole burden of the conversation falls on both of you. If there's 3 people, there's less stress in it, yeah, because you've got the 3 parties, yeah, in terms of the conversation. You can actually get stress on that. So I'm going into a sideline here. I remember sitting in Stellenbosch, where I have a visiting chair in South Africa, and there was a South African, a Welshman, and an Englishman having dinner together. So this is almost like a joke. And of course, we talked about rugby because this is a fascination for all 3 of us. And the Englishman was getting really fed up with the fact that the only thing South Africans and the Welsh are agreed on is that what really matters is that the English should lose. And so after a period of time, he said, why do you hate us so much? And I said, well, you have to remember what my grandmother went through. So when she was young, you know, the English decided we should be educated in Wales, which is quite generous of them. But it had to be in English, not Welsh. So if she was caught speaking Welsh in primary school, she had a wooden badge hanging around her neck, which had Welsh not written on it. That's what it's now called. She then had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she could hand over the knot. And whoever wore the knot at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. Yeah, and then they made up a song, Taffy was a Welshman, Taffy was a cheat, based on the fact that you would cheat like hell to avoid getting thrashed. Yeah, so I said, that's my memory. And the South African looked at him and said, I know exactly how you feel. They put my grandmother in a concentration camp. And at that point, there was total silence. That was a reference to the Boer War. Now, I'm making a double point on this. One is I'm getting the balance of 3 and the way it works, but I'm also pointing out that shared history matters. I do a lot of work with Maori and other indigenous groups. If I sit down and tell the story of the Welsh knot, I'm part of that clan, because everything, you know, it creates a shared history, a shared experience, yeah, which gives you that natural affinity in terms of the way you work. But the way trios works is you basically stop trying to solve problems by having task teams and tiger teams and committee meetings and sending out analysts to interview people. You put a group of 3 people together with sufficient cognitive, experiential, or disciplinary diversity and throw 20 trios at the problem part-time for a couple of weeks and see what they come up with. So to give some examples of this, one of the things we've been doing on user requirements is a young, bright, really fast prototyper together with an older systems architect or end user tester, i.e. somebody who's naive and bright and fast, together with somebody who's experienced to seize the whole system. Put them in a trio with a user trained to talk to IT people. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. And we might throw 15 trios at an abstract problem and see what they come up with ideas, prototypes, requirements. And then that gets reviewed and fed into, say, Scrum, which you can have in terms of liminal. Now you can see what we're also doing is as they work together, they'll start to form informal networks. They'll know each other. And we'd always put a trio together with people who had no previous knowledge or no previous working experience, because we get people to focus on working. Now, one of the ideas that came from that is when I was working on peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland back in the 70s. And there was a big thrust then, the thing called Coromila, which got Catholics and Protestants together for a week. And, you know, all sorts of facilitation techniques, all sorts of idealistic stuff, you know, trust exercises, wonderfully satirized in the first episode of series 2 of Derry Girls. If you haven't seen it yet, go and watch it. Yeah, where they did abseiling you know, Catholic girl has to hold Protestant boy going down slope and all that sort of stuff. And they claimed a huge success and got a lot of funding, but within weeks of people leaving the workshop, they were throwing petrol bombs again, because they didn't change the context from which the behavior came. It was temporary. The group I was with, which was a Jesuit group based down in Glen Cree, took basically 2 Protestants and 1 Catholic, or 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant, and threw them into Latin America or Africa for 6 months. And we didn't talk about the troubles. So we took people who were actually antagonistic, but in much smaller groups, and we put them into an environment where they discovered they had more in common, yeah, than they actually thought. And we created long-standing relationships from that. We're about to do that same technique in a large organization associated with climate change, which is suffering ideological differences. Rather than get lots of conversations which will reinforce the ideological divide, bring people together in trios to look at the real world problems and build those relationships that you can depend on. In work we've been doing on citizen engagement, we've used transgenerational pairing. So we put somebody under 18 together with somebody from their grandparents' generation, that's self-selecting. And their job is to come up with an innovative idea for their community. And by the way, there's a lot of cognitive neuroscience behind that. It's 2 different types of brain plasticity, originality and connectivity. You don't get much plasticity unless you have trauma between the ages of 20 and 45. So we're deliberately working with that. And if they come up with a really good idea, we put them into a trio with somebody from local or national government to make their idea work. So those are dyads becoming triads in that sort of sense. Now, I'm giving you that as an example because it's really easy to set up. It's really easy to run. And you're changing things through action, not by having conversations about the problem. And this is a broad principle of organizational design. People change through action less than they do by talking about it. The trouble is facilitators have this huge belief, yeah, that everybody should have conversations facilitated by them. I do a lot of work on peace and reconciliation, and I have regular fights with Boston consultants. And this is a classic neoliberal or neo-colonialist approach, in which they believe if only everybody came together in a room and they facilitated it, world peace would arise, and it ain't going to happen, yeah, in terms of the way it works. So multiple parallel deployment of trios, for those of you into Cynefin, that's actually a different form of safe to fail experimentation, and actually mapping who was in trios with who, and then creating rules for subsequent trios by which you can't be on a trio with people you've been on a trio before, over quite a short period of time, can get everybody intermeshed or entangled in ways where you can maintain a map. And then that becomes a measure for HR. How entangled is the organization? What are the degrees of separation? A variation on that, which is more elaborate, is social network stimulation. This is written up in a paper on our website and is available as a method. And this has 3 elements. It has rules for team formation. It has a goal, which is the success or failure of which is measurable in empirical terms. And it has a reward for the team associated with achievement of the goal. So I'll give the first time we ever did this as an example and then talk about how we developed it. So again, this was when I was working with IBM. And we had an issue with one of our big outsourcing contracts, a major bank. And the trouble with outsourcing, if anybody remembers outsourcing, it was the bee's knees like 20 years ago. And the whole proposition was, you know, hand over your entire computing department to us and we'll do it for a lower cost and we'll add value to you. It was quite interesting. The minute you did outsource, you discovered all the things your staff used to do for free, which aren't in the service level agreement, so you now have to pay extra for, but that was kind of like one of the ways it worked. But those nice sales consultants who sold you the idea were never the people who implemented it. What you got is what we used to call hairy-ass project managers, people who are brilliant at cost reduction, because in an outsourcing contract, you had to ramp the costs down pretty damn fast. And that required a sort of fairly brutal approach. You had like 2 years to do it in, yeah. And they always forgot about the added value section of the balanced scorecard. So to come to the end of the year, they panicked because they always looked at their targeting system. And then people like me got invited to come in and added value. Yeah. So we were invited to run workshops for the executives to get them excited about new things IBM were doing. Yeah. And then we'd phone up the project manager like 5 weeks later and say they were really excited by my idea for this. Can I come and do it? They say, oh no, it's far too risky. Please go away. So we realized, and we eventually called it performing SEAL time. We were meant to go in and balance balls on our nose, you know, and get everybody excited. But under no circumstances whatsoever was anything new meant to happen as a result of it. It was just to get a score in. So the added value one was a problem. So the first project we ran there was in 3 parts. So we basically said, if you can self-assemble a team based on these heuristics, and the heuristics force diversity. So 2/3 have to be ex-bank employees, 1/3 IBM, or vice versa. Somebody in the organization needed to have, in the team, needed to have joined within the last 6 months. I just did that intuitively and it worked brilliantly because it meant new joiners got integrated in very quickly and they had a naive approach. At least one member of your team had to have a degree in philosophy, sociology, or anthropology. And I double checked the HR database beforehand. So I played games with the heuristics, yeah? These are called enabling constraints in complexity. And some of the rules were designed to make sure that people couldn't be in a team with anybody they already knew or had worked with, because we already had those relationships in the bag and we wouldn't get sufficient diversity. This is where agile people get self-organization wrong. It's not about working with people you want to work with. It's about choosing who you work with within a constraint structure. Yeah? So we had those rules, and the target was $20 million of added value benefit to the client. Now that's only measurable by the client. It can't be played politics by IBM. So just because you're well connected, you can't win the prize, only if the client says you've got it. And the prize was 6 months sabbatical for all members of the winning team, which in a utilization-based consultancy group is a prize to actually assassinate your best friend for, because it takes you out of the utilization pool for a period. But if you think about it, $20 million of added benefit, 7 people, 6 months sabbatical, but there's a budget for it already anyway, 3.5 man years, that's a bloody good deal. Yeah. And actually about 3 or 4 groups achieved it, about 8 or 9 got close but didn't get it. So overall, it was extremely cost effective as a measure. And I still remember we were waiting outside the IBM boardroom because this was IBM's biggest client within the region. Nobody gave us a cat's chance in hell of getting this proposal through. It was considered too wild. The fact the board had called it in, even though it was in the regional general manager's authority, was an issue. And we were waiting outside, and IBM board meetings, there are all these little meeting rooms outside. And yeah, they're like dentist waiting rooms, including the type of magazines they have, right? Just to keep you occupied. And I remember we were in there and somebody just come and said, 10 minutes you're on. And one of the team said, you know, we haven't thought of something critical. And I said, oh, what's that? Thinking, you bastard. Right? And she said, how are we going to get people to self-organize into teams with people they don't know? Because we had the heuristics, nobody knew who fit me, you know, is it, oh, and I said, oh shit, we haven't thought of it, don't worry, they won't either, yeah, we'll work it out later. And guess what the first question was? Now, the one thing you don't do if you've got a revolutionary novel idea being presented to the board of a highly conservative company is say, we haven't thought of that, we'll come back to you, because you'll never get a chance. And by sheer luck, I've been reading this magazine, which had given me a form to fill out, where if I said what I was interested in, my educational background, my hobbies, and sent it off to this address, I would get an Eastern European bride sent to me by next day delivery. It was a dating agency site. Yeah. So adrenaline is a wonderful thing under conditions of stress. And I said, don't worry, we thought about that. We can use dating agency software. And if that doesn't work, we'll use speed dating. And I'm convinced that's how we got the contract through. The board just couldn't resist. So we loaded dating agency software on IBM's website. People searched for people who matched the criteria, took them out for a date and decided whether they could work with them or not. And that self-selection was key. Now, we now modify that technique so you have a range of intractable problems and a range of rewards, because your real goal is to network people, but you get three major benefits. One is it's a brilliant problem-solving technique, because you're, and in ideological terms of a leader, it's a wonderful way of actually saying, we trust you, these are our problems, we can't solve them, you can, and if you do solve them, we'll give you these rewards. Second benefit, it's a fairer way of allocating those rewards. Did one with a big pharmaceutical company for the head office staff, and the reward was to go on the annual sales trip, because they did all the work to support the salespeople, but they weren't in the Bahamas, on the target achievement type work. And the third thing is, if you run an SNS, social network stimulation, every 6 months for 18 months, and you have a rule which says nobody can be on a team where they've been on a team before, even in a company with 40% turnover and only 20% participation, within 18 months, everybody is within 2 degrees of separation of everybody else. And that's a wonderfully economical form of creating this dense informal network, this deliberate entanglement, which reduces the cost of the formal system. So, and one of the things, the big sections on the Coming EU Handbook on Crisis Management has this in it, because informal networks are far more successful in a crisis than formal systems, because trust is built into them. So kind of like dealing them with that quite quickly is there. Yeah. So I've given you 2 techniques there. I think I'll move on because I'll run out of time otherwise, and I want to leave time for questions. Yeah. I think the other big thing which we've been working on a lot is the concept of crews. Now, if you actually look, there's a book by Vike and Sutcliffe about mission critical organizations. And what it's about is organizations that share failure. Now, sharing failure is a critical measure of trust. I mean, you've all seen those, nice new age fluffy bunny type facilitation approaches, where everybody, everybody's got the butcher paper and they say, we will be a failure tolerant organization. If you admit your failure honestly, we'll all learn from it, we won't punish you. Well, anybody who believes that, this is a Darwinian technique to eliminate the fatally naive early on in their career, right? The reality is nobody in their right mind does that. If you're in a workshop and somebody asks you to admit your graded failure, we've all got a carefully rehearsed story which appears to say we failed, but actually proves how brilliant we were anyway, or sort of plays a sort of patriarchal dominance game about my failure was more profound than yours, therefore I should have power within the group. So there are all sort of dynamics on this. Yeah. So we know that failure sharing is very strong in informal networks. So I had one in IBM which had 5 people in it when I was developing early stage narrative techniques, and we shared all our failure in it because we all knew each other, we trusted each other. IBM found out about it, insisted it was made formal. So we spent a whole weekend stripping out all the failure and put the things we were prepared to share in the formal system, and then took our informal group into a network outside of IBM's mainframe structure. We weren't prepared to share with just anybody. Yeah. So that sort of trust thing is kind of like key on this in terms of the way it works. Yeah. Now, there's a variation on this, because what Vike and Sutcliffe found is that there were different groups of people who naturally shared failure without them being part of an informal network. So they looked at aircraft carrier crews, firefighting crews, and similar groups. What they didn't realize is they were talking about crews, not teams. So in a crew, people are trained into a role and role expectations. So if you're a pilot in an aircraft, you're trained in the role, and you know the nature of the interactions you have with the navigator and with the chief engineer. If you're a surgeon in a hospital, you have a highly developed role, and you know that if you've got a theatre nurse in the same role, even though you don't know her or know him, if you put up your hand at a key stage in the operation, they'll put the right instrument in it. So the interaction is between roles, not people. An entry into the role is nearly always ritualized, scrubbing up in a hospital, putting on a uniform, going through a checklist. Yeah. And what ritual does in humans is it's called cognitive activation. Yeah. So what it does is it associates that, the putting on uniform means your identity becomes coterminous with the role for a period of time. And therefore you're acting in a role, not acting as a person. Now that's actually very powerful. If you look at it, all military and civil contingency groups and medical groups and actually legal groups, the professions, lawyers, accountants, operate in crews, not teams. And the difference between the two is vital. In a team, you have to go through forming, norming, storming, performing, all that sort of stuff. In a crew, you can assemble a crew and it will instantly work because you've invested up front in the training. So starting to develop crews, so you can see what I'm building to, is informal network management. Crews allow you to deploy people from across silos, but you keep the hierarchies in place for pay and conditions and silo management, because those are the most valuable ways of doing that. So in terms of organizational design, those sort of three come together. The other thing is, and it's actually a classic approach, is people, it's really nice to blame the leader. I mean, this is the classic approach. I mean, I've seen it in every management fad for the last 40 years. And I mean, why people don't bother reading the history, I don't know. Every of them start off by saying, you need to have senior leadership commitment, or this failed because the leaders didn't fully support it. And it's a continuous theme of everything: business process reengineering, Six Sigma, knowledge management, blue ocean strategy, and now agile. They all go down the same route of claiming a universal when they're actually only a context specific. So basically, the problem on that, right, is that as you go through the management fads, the leadership keep getting the blame. Now, and it is also based on the engineering metaphor, which has underpinned the last 30 years' work. And that's actually quite dangerous, because what engineers want is a greenfield site. They want to design the organization from scratch based around an agreed purpose. The reality is, to pursue the metaphor, in an organization, you're always doing brownfield architecture, not greenfield architecture. There's history there you can't fully understand. And therefore, it's more important to actually evolve the system than it is to redesign it. I often say these days, if you want to actually achieve organizational change, do not announce an organizational change initiative, because you'll trigger negative reactions. And in evolutionary terms, if I take an ecological metaphor, I make small changes and see if they work before I make them universal. And even then I'm careful. So I'm evolving the system by changing the things I can manage in a complex adaptive system. And there's only three of those: the catalysts, the probes, the boundary conditions, and the energy allocation. Now, part of the problem is that we have evangelicals who believe in the new approach. I'm an agilist, all right? I have an agile mindset. If it wasn't for those evil managers and other people, it would all work. Now, that's actually wrong. And the trouble is, it leads people in desperation to play the Trojan horse strategy and say, why don't we adopt something like SAFE, which is the antithesis of agile? It's got bugger all to do with agile, but it sounds like it's agile. So we'll get them to adopt that because it looks familiar, and then we'll move into agile downstream, and that won't work either. The reality is, no leader with any goddamn sense, right, actually will adopt a new fad overnight. They're not going to do it. They've seen too many of them fail. They haven't got to that position by jumping on bandwagons, and you're sitting there doing a bandwagon, right? They want to sit, and they've got very small amounts of attention span. I've been a C-level executive, right? You get maybe 3 or 4 minutes to make a decision. And it's one of about 20 decisions you'll make that day, along with conference calls and meetings. And you've got 8 or 9 people arguing a case, all of whom have researched it, and all of them are coherent. How do you choose? Well, you choose the one you trust, or you choose the least risky route. And the conditions of extreme you might take risk. Anybody who demonizes leaders as a reason for their failure hasn't understood the burden of leadership. The leadership and managers in organizations And okay, we have got a sort of narcissistic quality to the leaders who swap at a high level. So just let me deal with this one. I mean, it used to be that leaders came up through the ranks. We had lifetime employment. Japanese companies have kept this for a limited amount of the workforce. So you served an apprenticeship, you did your middle management, you got to know people, you moved between silos. When you took over the company, you had tacit knowledge. What we then got was the growth of management consultancy. So you did a BA in business studies, an MBA at an elite school, you joined a big consultancy firm, you spent your entire time producing spreadsheets and writing reports about what other people should do. Then you moved in as a CEO without any relative experience, so you only managed through spreadsheets and through reports. Yeah? So that thing has produced perverse results. So yeah, and just qualify my earlier statement on that. But leaders who emerge from the organization generally have a huge amount of tacit knowledge, a great amount of understanding of what works. And it's quite an interesting contrast here between American and British hospitals. If I go into an American hospital to meet the dean, say of a medical research faculty, I'll always meet somebody in a white coat who's a doctor. If I go into a British hospital, I'll meet a manager in a suit with half a dozen lackeys providing them with data. And the American hospitals, they have other problems in terms of expenses and stuff like that, but they've understood that you need to be a doctor to manage a hospital, because there's a whole body of knowledge you can only have if you've been through that training and had that experience. For anybody who's watched House, all right, this is the Cully character. May not be the best doctor, but they're a doctor and they can be administrators, so they can handle the prima donnas. Yeah? So starting to think about that side of it is actually key, and starting to present change in a way in which managers can take experiments at low risk. And above all costs, do not be an evangelical. Yeah? Do not put up a 2-column slide set with the old ways are bad, the new ways are good. Because anybody with any real experience knows you're talking nonsense. There was nothing wrong with the old ways. They were just right within a certain context. And maybe now on the other side of that boundary, we need to do something different. So this sort of both and strategy is kind of like key. Now, I haven't gone into the full range of material and organizational design. The other thing I'll just briefly mention, because we're running this out currently on a major reorganization for an ecological pressure group, is where we present situational assessments to literally the whole of the workforce and ask them to all interpret it within the same 1-hour period. This is something we do with a software called SenseMaker. And they can't interpret it in gameable ways. So the interpretation isn't like a questionnaire where you know what answer is wanted. And what we do from that material is we draw what are called narrative fitness landscapes, which look like contour maps. And they show where people overlap, so where people have things in common and where they're different, yeah? And also we have maps which show outlier groups, people who think differently, yeah? And we can often find outlier groups between 2 groups of competitive people, so they think differently about one subject, but they work in other ways. Now that sort of mapping before you even start an organizational design is key, because you need to understand what the natural dispositional state is to see where you can make changes. The other thing is, I think people should stop demonizing Taylorism. Taylorism was replaced by systems thinking in the 80s. And I had the privilege of teaching leadership theory with Peter Drucker for a period, which was a huge privilege. He humiliated me badly at a conference, but decided I was redeemable, took me out for dinner, and then we ran some executive workshops together. And one of the things we both agreed is that Taylorism and complexity theory have a lot in common, and they're both very different from cybernetics and systems thinking. Because what we saw in the 80s with the growth of cybernetic systems thinking and management consultancy is an attempt to remove human judgment from the system. Because the system has been designed and the processes make the decisions for you. Taylorism accepted human judgment as a key component of management, and we're trying to bring judgment back into the system, yeah, now within complexity. So that sort of demonization is poor. But recognize that judgment comes through experience more than through training. In fact, the general rule is that informal networks provide most of the learning in an organization. Formal training is the least. And 2-day training with certificates based on filling out a multi-choice question actually produces no value whatsoever, apart from giving you some letters to put after your name. Sorry, I can't resist that one, right? So start to realize this sort of basis, and also realize that what happened in industry in Taylorism days is they took over a military model of decision making, but they took over the peacetime model. They didn't take over the wartime model. Military units change completely in conflict. And it's actually quite interesting. It comes back to crews. A weapons sergeant outranks a brigadier in respect of their weapon, because crews can deploy authority without loss of status in the way they work, yeah, in terms of delegation. A flight sergeant in the British Air Force is, well, if they're the pilot, yeah, then they're in charge from the minute they put on flying gear to the minute they take it off, even if a wing commander is actually their navigator. There's the ability to switch roles is key. So take an ecological model is kind of like one lesson on this, and I've given you some methods on that. And also realize that one size doesn't fit all. You need kind of like different ways and different methods in different contexts. And above all, take an ecological model, not an engineering model. And in an ecological model, you maybe make a boundary permeable and see what happens before you remove it completely. You do parallel catalytic probes, you increase the connectivity between people. And that's the last lesson I really want to emphasize, and that means I will finish with exactly 10 minutes to spare, so I'm quite proud of that. Above all, realize that fundamentally, informal networks and trust are probably the single most important factor in any organization. And you need to create that through a process of gradual deliberative entanglement. So think ecosystem, not machine. Think brownfield site, not greenfield site. Think about progressive change. Think about reinforcing things that work and disrupting things that don't. And above all, realize that context is king. Okay.
Thank you very much, David. That was very, very insightful, and you did get to time as well. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. We've got a few questions which we captured throughout. I'll just read them out and save me sort of flip-flopping between everybody. And hopefully we'll get some answers for those people here. We're finishing at past. So the first one was from Florian here. What's your opinion on the chance of entanglement in the 100% distributed work world we all have at the moment?
I think it's quite interesting, actually. I mean, this is a whole subject in its own right. I think we're actually seeing high levels of mental breakdown and stress. Zoom is actually a problem because you have visual and sound, but you don't have smell. And actually, we rely heavily on things like smell and other senses, yeah, in a physical meeting. And there's no breathing space. You jump from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting with rapid switches of context with no sort of ritual transfer. I'm trying to find ways to ritualize time to read because I used to do that on planes. So I think we've proved that you can do a lot of things virtually, but they're different. So we're just about to announce our new retreat structure. This is where we do idea generation. And the first one up this year is going to be on semiotics and aesthetics, i.e. the role of art in organizations, which is actually a huge issue. And one of the things we've learned is that you actually need presentations to be asynchronous, not synchronous. So we now record, lectures and have people look at that in advance because the lecturer doesn't get feedback. If I'm lecturing to an audience, I get feedback I can adjust. If I'm lecturing to Zoom, I can't. Therefore, it's better to record it and let people listen to it 2 or 3 times and then have a discussion. Yeah. So I think we're learning combinations of practice. But we had a team meeting on Monday and we just took everybody to a pub, on the River Wye. We were physically distanced. We went for a walk and I mistakenly forgot it was high summer and there would therefore be bramble bushes and fern. So I may or may not be forgiven for that at some stage because everybody had shorts. we had conversations. The conversation went far faster because we could see, hear, smell, the physical contact is there. So I think we'll see the balance shift to distributed, but I think the physical will still be there in some ways. I think the other thing is that informal networks actually are stronger in a virtual environment. So I haven't done any major Zoom call with a client without having a Skype channel open in parallel, and sometimes 4 Skype channels open in parallel, having conversations. And occasionally, if I get bored, I try and clear email, right? So this sort of ability to do things in parallel and validate and check things, people are building new skills and techniques, yeah? So I think the informal networks are still a part of that. The formal system is still there because people still require leadership. And we get this wrong, right? In a crisis, you need leaders who can give direction. If you just have everything as spontaneously self-organizing, it won't work. I need to be careful what I say here, but we're working with one organization who's to get rid of holacracy. Because what holacracy does, it was written by a programmer who doesn't want to exercise management judgment. So it rewards people who are highly bureaucratic, who follow the rules. And therefore it's not adaptable under conditions of stress. So a lot of these so-called horizontal systems actually don't work on a sustainable basis anyway. There's a time when you want leadership and direction. There's a time when you just want to phone somebody up and say, look, I can't cope anymore, deal with it. And that's one of the roles of a leader. Yeah. I mean, I did a performance review this morning with one of my assistants, yeah, who has huge potential to grow into be a senior manager. And she was saying, I've got this cognitive task of jumping between 4 or 5 clients simultaneously. And I said, well, I've gone between 20 clients and 3 businesses in the last 24 hours. And that's what you want to be. If you want to get up to a next level, you're going to have to handle massive cognitive dissonance and diversity. Yeah. And that sort of stuff is actually, I think, more difficult in a virtual environment than a physical one. And so we're going to be developing new leadership models around that. I don't know whether that answered this, and I rambled a bit, but that would be.
It's fine. I think you answered a number of questions there at the same time, really. So we have a couple more in here I think we've got time for. Do you think Tuckman's phases of forming teams is accurate? That's from Russ.
I think it's a social construct on observed behavior, but I actually wouldn't bother about it because I would use trios or crews. I think I just haven't got time for team formation. I think it's a waste of energy.
Yeah, and you find that it's quicker for a team or a trio to get up to speed by having that kind of just jump straight in and get everyone kind of working together.
And there's only 3 people and they're under time pressure is wonderful. I mean, 3 conditions for innovation are starvation, pressure, and perspective shift. Yeah, if you resource something, it doesn't work. So the trios, actually, you're starved of time, you're under intense pressure, and you've got 2 people you don't know who you've got to pay attention to. It's actually a wonderful peace and conflict technique.
Interesting, yeah. Thank you very much. We've got one question here from Andrew saying how to get the best value out of informal communities of practice without squashing them with procedures and SOPs. Well,
first of all, you don't. I mean, the whole point about informal networks is you just measure, have you got them? You don't actually try and manage them. This is the original title of this, which is the Italian, for the origin of the word manage in English is from the Italian, which is the handling of training in horses, which is a co-evolutionary process. The word then gets corrupted by the French. I mean, many things have been corrupted by the French, but not as many as been corrupted by the English, to mean household management. And that's how we see it. But the reality is you need both, right? And that's how to see management, right? So informal networks are measured by network density, and you focus on connecting things, but you don't try and manage the output or manage the people, which is why it's a very low energy cost, The formal systems take a lot of energy. If you read Complex Acts of Knowing, which was the first major Cynefin article, that actually describes this and talks about using the informal to actually form the formal. So for example, I've got 5 research assistants, stroke project managers, stroke good friends, right? They're all late 20s, early 30s. They're all, as it happens, female, and they're collectively known as the Coven. right? And they quite like being called a coven. It has a form of identity and it scares the shit out of people, right? But half of them have been recruited by them. I mean, I and others make the decision, but actually we recruit from people they already know and trust because they know what it means to work, and we put people on probation. That's far more effective than trying to issue a CV and search people out and match criteria. Informal networks are more effective at that.
Interesting. Thank you very much. I've got a one that's just popped in. What is your opinion about complex responsive processes relating compared to CAS or CAS? That's from Florian again.
Florian, you'll have to expand on that because there are various theories of complex responsive processes. So you'll have to tell me what you mean by it.
Let me just unmute. There we go.
Yeah, Dave, thank you. Yeah, it's purely accidental. I learned about it this morning. So I was curious about, because it seems to me that it's more like less of a system and more of complexity and less of a system compared to complex to CAS. So that's my thought about it. So I was curious about your talk because I was really intrigued by it. What your opinion about it was, but as I said, I just discovered it this morning, so I'm pretty blue at this.
Yeah, I mean, this is Mark's stuff and other people's, all right? I mean, the field I work in is called Anthro Complexity, right? So that's the combination of complexity science with anthropology, with cognitive neuroscience. CRP in its original form comes from Ralph Stacey and his group at Hartford. And my problem with that is it's entirely postmodernist. So it believes that, there are two schools of thought on complexity. One is that ontologically, a complex system is different from a complicated system, is different from a chaotic system. And the other one, if you look at the Stacey matrix, is that everything is on a continuum based on human perception. So I think that's a major problem. Yeah, I think the other major problem with the Stacey method, particularly when you look at people like Patricia Shaw, is it's heavily based on facilitation, so it doesn't scale. Yeah. The best book in that series, by the way, is one where Stacey wrote with Doug Griffin on leadership, and that's definitely worth reading. Right. So I think they're in the complexity as a metaphor, heavy facilitation, heavy ideological approach. But they are a school within complexity groups. So you've got, an anthro complexity is another one, right? But we take a naturalistic approach and a realist approach and an anti-postmodernist approach. So our approach is to apply natural science to social systems, not as a metaphor, but as a real constraint.
Great stuff. Thank you very much for answering that question there. I think we're out of time, which is brilliant. We've gone to time there. We will be sharing this as a recording. It'll be going out to our YouTube channel, and we'll be pushing out to the meetup group the link to that. We are a Scrum user group, so you do get 1 SCU for attending today. Do let us know if you need any help with that. And I just want to say thanks again to David for taking the time out from the lovely weather that's outside and for taking us through that today. Thank you so much, Dave.
Yeah, pleasure. Great
stuff. We'll be announcing the date in the next few weeks. Should be the end of August, and we'll announce the speaker through the channel as well. All right, thank you very much. Enjoy your evening, everybody. Thank you.